I met Tony 3 weeks after my mum died. I was leaving for work at the time. I just locked my door to my flat when I heard a noise behind me. I turned around, and there he was. A short, tired-looking man with glasses and messy brown hair. Pale, as though he hadn't seen the sun in weeks. The phrase, "you look like how I feel," is a cliché, but in this case, it made sense. At that time, I was a ghost. I'd had 2 weeks off after Mum's funeral, but it wasn't enough. Nowhere near. Looking back, I guess I was depressed. Although I wouldn't have been able to tell you that then. Mainly, I just felt numb. I'd go between not giving a damn about anything to feeling like I was about to cry for no reason at all. Often I did cry for no reason at all. I'd sit in my flat in the evenings, staring at the TV without taking anything in. I drank most nights. Not so much that I was wasted or anything, but enough. Enough to take the worst of the pain away. Since the funeral, I'd mainly been avoiding calls from friends, and, aside from some awkward exchanges at work, Tony was the first person I'd spoken with in a while. My first conversation. If you could call it conversation anyway. "I've seen you around." Tony walked along the corridor towards me. He wore jeans and a dark blue jumper. The glasses on his face glinted with the reflection of the corridor's fluorescence. "Oh yeah?" I turned and locked the door to my flat. This wasn't a conversation I wanted to have. Speaking to people I knew was hard enough at that time, let alone strangers, and small talk was the last thing on my mind. "That's right," said Tony. "On the way to work, coming back home. I live just down the hall. I waved to you once or twice, but I don't think you noticed. You seem to be off in your own little world." I froze with my key in the lock. Off in your own little world. It was an expression my mum used to use all the time. We'd been chatting, and she'd catch me staring out the window or gazing into the distance, and she'd say it. "Uh-oh, we've lost Matt. He's off in his own little world again." My face suddenly felt hot. This was how it happened back then. The grief was always there. It hung beneath me like some vast, freezing ocean. And no matter how careful I was walking along the ice, the cracks still showed. Tony must have seen it in my face. The next thing I knew, he was standing beside me, asking if I was okay. And a second after that, my eyes were welling up. I don't remember much about our conversation. I guess he must have comforted me, asked me what was wrong. I think he told me that he felt sad sometimes too, and it was important to have people to talk to. He asked me to give him my number so he could check in with me. I guess because I was feeling vulnerable, I did. The only other thing I remember about the conversation is what he told me at the end. That about a year ago, his dad had died. Tony said he didn't know exactly how I was feeling. No one could. But he understood it. At least in part. And the last thing he gave me before I finally left for work was some advice. "Talk to her out loud," he said. "When you're on your own, just pretend you're chatting on the phone with her, if that makes it easier." He paused and adjusted the glasses on his face. "I can't promise it'll make you feel better, but it might. It was the only thing that helped me." I forgot about the conversation with Tony. The next few days were the usual blur of tears in the shower and just making it through work, and then beer in front of the TV. It was like I was living the same 24 hours on loop. Cry, drink, sleep, wake up, repeat. The worst damn Groundhog Day you can imagine. People told me it'd get easier with time. I counted at least 4 people who said that exact sentence to me at Mum's funeral. It didn't. In those endless weeks after her death, the pain never went away. "Morning, Matt," it'd say whenever my eyes creaked open. "Maybe you were thinking that today life might be a little better, but guess what? It's not, and it won't be for a long, long time." I suppose a part of me knew I needed to get help. Somewhere far back in my mind, an alarm was going off. The faintest SOS call. But it was impossibly distant. I ignored it. The thought of phoning up the GP and booking an appointment just made me feel tired. It was during one of those endless, blurry days that I heard from Tony again. I'd just finished watching a documentary about cancer. I know, great choice of viewing material, right? Normally I sit in front of a Netflix series and switch off my brain, but this one caught me just as I turned on the TV. The program was about how scientists are trying to determine the extent to which cancer, or at least the likelihood of getting cancer, can be hereditary. How much of it is in the genes. My mind immediately went to Mum, of course. I pictured her in the hospital bed, the poisonous cells raging through her body. Then I found myself imagining similar cells in my own organs, buried deep down in the tissue. Maybe not doing anything just yet, at least, but biding their time, waiting. I can still remember that thought process going through my head. And the worst part wasn't the idea that I might one day die too young like Mum had. No, the worst part was that the thought didn't scare me. Not even a bit. Right then, it actually filled me with relief, because at least a terminal illness would mean I'd know when the pain was going to stop, right? At least then, there'd be an end in sight. It was at that point that my phone buzzed. The vibration nearly made me jump. There had been a steady stream of messages after the funeral, but they'd started to dry up over the past week. My fault, of course. I wasn't replying to any of them. Support only goes so far. I pulled my phone from the pocket of my jeans, glanced on the screen, and saw the WhatsApp logo. I was about to chuck the phone down onto the sofa when something made me pause. There was no name on the message, just a number. The photo was nothing I recognized either, just a blurry picture taken in a forest. Then my eyes flicked to the message itself, and a tiny ice pick pierced the numbness of my brain. "You told me you're not religious," read the message, "but do you believe in ghosts?" What the hell was this? I looked at it again, carefully, to make sure I hadn't misread it. No, the message was as clear as anything, and I didn't recognize the number it had come from. I stared around my lounge, thinking. I'd obviously lost track of the time while watching TV, because it was now completely dark outside. I peered into the blackness beyond the glass doors that led onto my tiny balcony. Aside from a few lights from neighbouring flats, all I could see was my own reflection. Not a pretty sight. I looked tired and ill. The bags under my eyes were deep bruises. A frown of confusion creased on my forehead. Who the hell would send me a message like this? My mind cycled through a list of possibilities. Someone at work doing it for a joke? No chance. Nobody I worked with was that cruel, I didn't think. Plus, I hadn't given any of them my mobile number. It could be spam then. Just some random troll firing off weird messages to random numbers. This seemed more likely, but I still doubted it. Maybe if the message had come up via email, I would have believed that. But I never experienced anything like that on WhatsApp before. Then my mind went to Tony. He was the only new person I'd met recently, wasn't he? The only one I'd given my number to. I pictured his glasses and his messy hair, the faintest look of concern as he comforted me in the hallway. The guy hadn't seemed off at the time, but then you never really knew, did you? Not with someone you'd only just met, and it wasn't as if I'd been in a fit state of mind to judge. I stared at the phone in my hand. For a moment, I considered just ignoring the message and going to bed. But something got the better of me. I think it was the wording of the message itself. You told me you're not religious, but do you believe in ghosts? There was just something about those two sentences that I couldn't let go of. Despite how tired and numb I felt, they gave me the creeps. Only a little bit, but the feeling was definitely there. I picked up the phone and typed a response. "Is this Tony?" The reply came back less than a minute later. "Yes." For a minute, I considered a blunt response. Something short, asking him why he was messaging me stuff like this at all, reminding him we'd only just met. But in the end, I decided to play the game. Part of it was curiosity, I suppose. Maybe the other part was that I wanted the distraction. "Hi, Tony," I wrote. "I don't really know what I think about ghosts, to be honest. I know I've never seen one. I suppose I wouldn't rule it out, though. Why?" The message sent. A moment later, 2 little grey ticks told me it had been delivered, and a second after that, the ticks turned blue. Tony had read my reply. His own came a couple minutes later. "Have you ever thought about what happens after we die? I read something about violent deaths leaving an imprint. Murder, suicide. They said the spirits of the victims can struggle to move on after. They enter people's dreams." Jesus Christ. I read the reply a couple of times, unable to make much sense of it. I pictured Tony's face again. The glasses, the concerned expression. It didn't make sense to me. But there was really only one conclusion. Tony was a nut job. Had to be. I wanted to laugh the message off, and had I been with a friend, or more inclined to pick up the phone and call one, I almost certainly would have. But I was alone, sitting in an empty lounge, staring down at the phone in my hand. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but that sense of unease I'd felt earlier was growing. Part of it was being in the dark flat without company, I suppose, but that wasn't all of it. What if Tony was genuinely disturbed? You heard about it all the time in the news, didn't you? Someone strikes up a casual conversation in a coffee shop, and the person they're talking to gets the wrong idea, ends up following them home, showing up outside their house at night, stalking them. My eyes flicked from the dark balcony to the door leading out from my lounge. My hallway lay beyond it, and beyond that was the front door of my flat, and just along the corridor outside was Tony, sat in his own flat, even now, less than 20 minutes away, as he sent these messages. The thought made me shiver. I tried to remember if I'd locked the front door or not, but couldn't. I was about to get up when my phone pinged again. If you're interested in hearing ghost stories, we can talk in person sometime. I'm not far. My skin felt cold. It was time to nip this in the bud. I typed my reply and sent it quickly. Thanks for the offer. I'm going to head to bed now, but maybe another time? 2 blue ticks, straight away. Tony was in his flat, phone in hand, waiting for my replies. I got up from the sofa and pulled the blinds, shutting out some of the darkness. Then I picked up the remote and switched the TV off. As I walked across the lounge in the direction of my kitchen, I was aware of just how quiet the flat was. With the TV off, silence filled the room. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of cars on the road outside. Nothing else. As I reached the kitchen and pulled a glass from the cupboard, I heard a door slam. I froze. My grip on the glass tightened as I stood still, listening. The sound had been close. There were a lot of flats in my building, sure, and sounds often carried down the halls. But still, that slam had sounded nearby, like the noise had come from one of the other flats on my corridor. You're being paranoid, I told myself. Tony is just a lonely guy who lost a parent, just like you. He probably watched a documentary about ghosts or something and it freaked him out. That's all. I had a bad taste in my mouth. Too much beer. My tongue felt dry and tacky, like cotton. I filled the glass at the sink, tipped it into my mouth, and downed the contents. As I was going back for a refill, my phone pinged again. Are you sure you don't want me to come over? I'm worried about you. In any other context, the message would have been fine, maybe even reassuring. But standing in the silence of my flat at what must have been gone 11 at night, it was the exact opposite. Cold pinpricks ran their way up the skin of my back. I left the glass on the side and started towards the hallway of my flat, intending to make sure the front door was locked. I was halfway across the lounge when my phone buzzed again. I think I can help you. I picked up my pace. My hands were sweating now, and the skin on the back of my neck itched. I strained my ears for a sound from the corridor beyond my front door, but couldn't hear anything. Silence. The only noise was the soft rustle of my socks on the wood flooring. I passed the bedroom on my right, then the bedroom on my left, rounded the corner of the hallway. In front of me, only 3 meters away, stood my front door. I could see the direction the latch was twisted, off to the left. Something clenched in my stomach. I'd forgotten to lock it. I started towards the door. My phone was still clenched in my sweaty right hand, and I was so focused on getting to the door that I barely noticed it buzz again. I fumbled it into my left hand, reaching for the lock. Someone knocked on the door. I froze. Thump, thump, thump. 3 knocks, loud and heavy in the silence of my flat. I stood completely still, my hand hanging in midair just in front of the latch. I wanted to move forward and twist it, but I couldn't bring myself to. Fear prickled in my skin. Helplessly, I felt my eyes flick away from the latch, slightly off to the left. My gaze was drawn to a beady black eye in the middle of my front door. The peephole. I hadn't used the peephole much during my time in the flat, but there were a couple of occasions I remembered pressing my eye to it. Once, when some kids who lived in the building were knocking a football down the corridor, Another time when a charity worker had come up to the door. The peephole was one of those that gave you a fisheye view of the corridor outside, a magnified lens that distorted shapes and messed with perspective. If someone was standing on the other side of the door and you peeked through it, their face would appear giant and stretched. I took a step forward. I brought my right foot down just in front of the door, as softly as I could, desperate not to make a sound. My skin crawled with fear. My heart pounded the inside of my chest, a relentless fist. I stretched my right hand out and closed it around the latch. Thump, thump, thump. The knocks were louder this time. They punched through the air like drum beats. I felt the door tremble beneath my hand, and I bit down on my lip, hard, to stop from screaming. I tensed my body and flicked the latch to the right. It clicked into place. Something banged against the outside of the door, hard. Thud, thud. The whole thing rattled on its hinges. I kept my grip on the latch and screwed my eyes shut. The taste of copper filled my mouth where I'd bitten my lip. I held my breath. Silence. It stretched on and on. I strained my ear for any noise from the corridor, the slightest sound. But there was nothing. Just the faint hum of my refrigerator in the kitchen and the noise of my pulse, pounding its relentless drumbeat. I don't know how long I stayed like that. All I remember is that at some point, some unknown length of time later, I worked up the courage to look through the peephole. There was nobody there. The corridor stretched off to the right and left, completely empty. Whoever had knocked on the door was gone. I only remembered my phone, which was still clutched in my left hand, when I was safely back in my bedroom. There was one new WhatsApp notification on the screen from Tony. Just 2 words. Sleep well. It took me a long time to fall asleep that night, and when I did sleep, I dreamed. Tony was in them. He slipped in and out of my mind like a shadow. Some of the dreams were real memories, others were scenes my subconsciousness must have conjured up. First, I was back in the corridor, wiping my eyes as he comforted me. Next, I could see his stretched face, glasses glinting in the light from the overhead fluorescence as I stared at him through the peephole. Later, he was in my bedroom. That was the part of the dream I remember most, the bit that stayed with me after I woke up. Tony sat in a chair beside my bed, his face shrouded in darkness as he spoke. "You need help, Matt. I can help you." I tried to tell him to go away. Tried to say I didn't want his help. But I couldn't talk. My mouth wouldn't work. I know. Tony's voice was soft in the darkness. "You don't want it, do you? Talking's too tiring." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just lay in the darkness, watching the shape beside my bed. "Speaking out loud to her is the first step," Tony continued. "That's what helped me, with Dad. But it wasn't enough. You need to talk to other people too." I tried to tell him I couldn't talk. My mouth still wouldn't open. But the next thing I knew, I was breathing sharply, pulling air into my lungs like a drowning man. And then, the moment after that, I was sitting straight up in bed in the darkness of my room. I looked to my left. The chair beside me stood empty. Tony was gone. I never saw him again. As quickly as he'd come into my life, Tony left. There were no more meetings in the corridor, no more WhatsApp messages. After a couple of days, I began to wonder if the whole thing had even happened. If maybe it was nothing more than a hallucination, the product of too much alcohol and grief. It wasn't though. I know it wasn't. Because every time I'd start to think that, I'd just open up WhatsApp. The whole conversation with Tony was still there, plain as day. And even though I have a new phone number now, I've kept the screen grabs. All of them. They are a reminder. A few days after that strange night, I had cause to be reminded. I had a reason to keep checking WhatsApp. A reason to keep the whole thing on record. A reason to prove to myself it was real. It happened when I saw a man coming out of Tony's flat. I was coming back from work at the time, unlocking my door when I heard Tony's open. I glanced to my right, my pulse quickening. But it wasn't him. The man in front of me was large, with a full belly and shaved head, a bag of tools in his right hand, pencil tucked behind one ear. Someone I'd never seen before. There was no reason for me to talk to him. No reason at all. The guy could have been an electrician or a plumber. Anything. I still don't know why I asked the question I asked. Did Tony move out? The man stopped mid-stride and stared at me. I saw a handful of expressions cross his face in less than a second. First, his eyes widened with surprise. Then his brow creased up. He opened his mouth slightly and darted a tongue across his lips. Looking at his face, I had the sudden, horrible idea that he was about to tell me there was no Tony. "Don't know what you're talking about, mate," he'd say. "The flat's been empty for months." He didn't though. He said something worse. "Tony?" The man scratched his hand across his scalp. "Was he a friend of yours?" "No, not really. We bumped into each other in the hallway once or twice. Are you related to him, or..." No, I'm the landlord. I own the flat." The man adjusted the pencil behind his ear and cleared his throat. He looked at me, then looked away again. "Look, I'm sorry to be the one to have to tell you this, but, well, Tony..." He trailed off. The corridor around me suddenly felt too hot. I had an urge to reach out and shake him. "What happened?" "Well..." The man stared at his shoes a moment longer, then sighed. He looked up at me. "He died. Tony did. He's dead, I'm afraid." I felt the corridor swim around me. My mouth felt dry. "When?" "A couple months ago, I think. I couldn't believe it when I heard." He paused and cleared his throat. "Pretty tragic, eh?" I didn't say anything. I was too busy thinking about what Tony's landlord had just told me. He died. A couple months ago, I think. My mind went to the phone in my pocket, the messages I'd received on it only 3 days before, the meeting in the corridor only a few days before that. "Are you sure it was a couple of months? Eh? When Tony died, are you sure it wasn't more recent?" The landlord frowned. "Positive. More than that, maybe. I've got the date on a form somewhere else, I think. Something from his next of kin." He kept talking, but his voice suddenly sounded far away, like it was reaching me from the opposite end of a pipe. An image of Tony as I'd first seen him in the corridor, pale in his dark blue jumper, swam into my mind. I felt faint. I don't remember much else about what the landlord said. I know he spoke a little longer, him doing most of the talking, me asking occasional, stunted questions, but most of the conversation is a blur. There's only one other thing I do remember, and that's what the man told me when I asked him how Tony died. He said he'd killed himself. The end of the story can be told quickly. It's really more of a beginning than an end. It started with me talking out loud to Mum. This was the morning after my meeting with the landlord. I was sat in my flat at the time, having breakfast, coffee and toast, and in between mouthfuls, I told her about Tony. Meeting him in the corridor, the WhatsApp messages, the landlord, all of it. I pretended we were on the phone. I didn't expect it to do much, if I'm honest. I had no big hopes. But as I dumped my dirty plate into the dishwasher and left the flat for work that morning, I felt, well, something. I'm not going to tell you talking out loud cured me. The black cloud that had sat in my head ever since Mum got sick didn't dissipate over coffee and toast. But I guess it was a start. Over the coming days, I found myself talking to Mum more and more. When I was at home on my own making dinner, in bed at night, before I left for work. At some point in that process, I got another WhatsApp message. Not from Tony this time, from a friend. One of many I've been doing my best to ignore since the funeral. But this time, I answered it. Friends on the phone, family, friends in person, then eventually the GP. I don't remember all the details from the months after Mum's death, just certain moments. I remember turning up to the doctors and crying when they diagnosed me with depression. I remember going to the pharmacy to pick up my citralopram prescription, and I remember my first counselling session. I spoke about Mum in it. I spoke about the final days with her at the hospital. Over the following weeks and sessions, I told her more and more. It's been months now since I attended that first session, but I still go every week. I'm a work in progress. And on the days when I'm really struggling, on the days when the ground beneath my feet feels numb and I can sense the cracks starting to show through the ice, on those days, I think of Tony. Not so much about his death and the conversation I had with his landlord. That mystery no longer seems as important somehow. But more about the stuff he said to me. In the corridor and over WhatsApp that night. In my dream. The warning he gave me. Mostly though, I think about how lucky I am to still be here. I think about how I owe Tony for that. And I think of the opportunities I have that he never did. I picked up geocaching a few years after it became a thing. I got bored of hiking my same old trails. It added a little bit of spice to my boring life. Gave me a goal to work towards, even if it was a small one. I lived in a place with a ton of forest and rural land. It's a beautiful area with lots of national forests and public trails. With those features, it's kind of a treasure hunter's ideal stomping grounds. I found some neat stuff in my endeavours. The heart-shaped locket in a little tin candy box behind a brick in the local community garden, a little wooden whistle shaped like a bird in the hollow of a tree near the elementary school. an arrowhead replica in an Altoids tin in a creek. You get the idea. It was never anything big, but it was the sense of old school adventure I had that really made leaving behind a favourite old baseball card in a plastic Ziploc bag worth it. For those of you that don't know, when you geocache, you're supposed to leave an object of equal value inside of the cache box. It's sort of like a scavenger hunt set up by your own community. A very different kind of cache came into play 3 years after I started. It was supposed to be like a puzzle, a friend had explained. We found a few boxes where the organizer left small stuff and different coordinates, leading to a big prize at the end. That intrigued me, of course, as I was always more than pumped for a new challenge. After finding a brand new one that I was sure I'd been the first to pursue, I wrote the coordinate set down and headed out. It led me to a place I'd been a couple of times before. It was a forested area in the mountains with a small picnic pavilion at the entrance. Nobody was there, but then again, there wasn't usually anyone else, as this wasn't a very popular spot. At one point, I'd really liked this place, having picnicked there as a kid. Something smelled like old garbage that day though, and I could feel eyes, despite having seen no other cars in the gravel parking area. I honestly figured that the park rangers were neglecting their trash duties at a low traffic trail and drinking some beers, as I was pretty far up in the mountains. I disregarded it, thinking that if I was having a beer on the job, I wouldn't want anyone reporting me for it as long as I wasn't hurting anybody. I had to have offline navigation tech, and cell phones were pretty useless. Hence, I only had my navigator and my iPod. You also have to consider that this was probably around 2005 or so. As I pushed forward on the trail and eyed my coordinates, I ended up at a huge rock, covered in moss and other flourishing fungus. I looked up and down, finally spotting an unfinished wooden box hiding amongst the lichens at the base of the rock. It had moss and wet leaves covering it, making it hard to see from most angles. When I opened the box, I'm sure I gasped out an expletive. Inside was a tiny, desiccated mouse skeleton, along with a coordinate sheet. I busted out laughing just after. This was tragically funny. Some poor baby mouse had gotten in there somehow, eating the candy or bubblegum the last idiot had probably left inside. I placed a nickel from my pocket inside of the box and discarded the mouse skeleton. I walked for probably half an hour to get to the next cache, but between listening to my iPod and taking in the untamed nature around me, I really didn't notice. This time, the coordinates were for a clearing. This cache proved harder to find until I looked up. Tied to a fairly high limb of a tree, skirting the clearing, there was what looked like a modified army canteen. Who the hell? I groaned. I was confused about why someone would choose such an inaccessible place for a geocache. This was a family game, for Christ's sake. I guess I was more miffed because the confusion didn't stop me from scaling the old tree as best as I could. I managed to snatch the canteen off the branch before falling on my ass. I was fine, glad that it was over with so that I could get on to the next location. Hopefully, it'll be easier to get to than this one. I popped the canteen open via a split in the midsection, peering inside. What the hell? The words buzzed on my lip like static. Inside were probably a dozen or more rusty, dirty razor blades. I practically threw the canteen, dumping out the razors. The coordinate sheet fluttered out as the forest around me began to blur. I need to leave, I said to no one, feeling my mouth go unbelievably dry as my vision tunneled. Miserably, I looked at the coordinate sheet and the dirt in front of me. It had landed right in front of me like a taunt from God. Keep going on the trail. Don't even think about turning around, smiley face. The message made chills run up and down my spine. I suddenly was all too aware of the presence of eyes on me once again. I really couldn't leave. There was really some crazy person out here. My mind regrettably went back to the foul garbage smell near the picnic area, making my stomach lurch. I walked in oppressive silence. Every snap of every twig made me go rigid. Every time a bird took flight, I would jump without fail. I was on pins and needles, scared of my own footfall and shadow. By this time, I was 40 more minutes away from where I had started. Now, I was nearly an hour and a half away from my car, away from any road, away from safety. As much as that bothered me, what bothered me more was that I was an hour and a half closer to whoever the hell thought rusty razor blades were a good GeoCache prize. This thought sank deeper into the pit of my stomach when I saw that I was coming up on what looked like an abandoned mine shaft from when the area had been a hotspot for iron and coal. This was where the coordinate sheet had led me. I could hear water flowing somewhere in the dark of the unnatural cave. Taking a deep breath, using the dim light from my iPod as a torch, I stepped into the old shaft. I walked about 15 feet, the narrow walls closing in and making me feel claustrophobic. The air tasted like mold and wet dirt. The shaft dropped suddenly about 30 more feet, but I was lucky enough to have been eyeballing the ground the entire time. I quickly spotted a fairly large jar sitting on one of the achingly old wooden supports below. I kneeled, reaching down and trying to avoid looking at the unmistakably human silhouettes lying in various bent and broken positions just beneath the drop. At this point, I couldn't tell if the noise of rushing water was coming from beneath me or from my own ears. I grasped the jar, backpedaling into what I now considered claustrophobic safety. I shone the feeble light of my iPod on the jar. It was the size of one of those ones you see in a gas station, usually with pickles or eggs or whatever weird local stuff small-town gas stations try to peddle. It took every ounce of willpower I had not to drop the container and shatter it, releasing the contents into the sodden earth beneath my feet, probably sealing my doom. Inside the slightly cloudy jar was a pair of pliers and probably 1,000 or so human teeth. I'd been so absorbed in getting the hell out of the mine shaft that I tumbled out of the entrance into the failing light of sunset. The rusted jar lid popped open, sickening me further with a fetid smell. My hand shook as I pulled out the scrap of paper from the jar of nightmares, trying to avoid looking at the dried bits of nerve and flesh clinging to some of the teeth. I mostly didn't want to think about how fresh some of them looked. The piece of paper only had one number this time. It wasn't a coordinate sheet. I flipped the paper over, praying for the gotcha to finally come. You know what to do. The number is how many I want. You are very lucky I'm not taking all of them. Smiley face. In the end, most would agree that 5 isn't a big number. $5 isn't a lot, 5 minutes isn't much time. Even 5 years can fly by once you get older. But pulling 5 teeth out of your own skull with dirty pliers, alone in the woods with some psychopath most likely watching you, that's a whole hell of a lot more than the quantity you probably imagine when you're thinking of 5. Yes, I told the police and reported it to the GeoCache headquarters, but the police and rescue squad supposedly found nothing in the mineshaft. There was no bloody jar of teeth, there were no corpses in the mine, and there wasn't even garbage in the trash cans. GeoCache said that the cache I was hunting had never been registered to their site, which is nonsense. But I didn't press. Even after rumours flew in a small town, rumours that I was crazy enough to rip my own teeth out in the woods, I didn't press it. I just moved on to greener pastures. I have 4 porcelain implants now. This was well over 10 years ago. I also have children now. My wife and I still love nature. We've even taken the kids geocaching in high-traffic trail areas. She knows my story, and even if it's against her better judgment, I know she believes me, because she avoids the topic of lost teeth around me when she can. She deals with the tooth fairy stuff too. Last year, my son asked me if we could go geocaching at an all too familiar location that popped up while we were visiting my parents. I told him no, and bought him a Switch instead to keep the bombardment of why not away. Mostly because when asked the first time, my tongue found the empty hole where my molar had once been. Because I'm your dad and I want to keep you safe. Now, what game can you and your sister play on Switch together without arguing? On the 4th of September 2019, a satellite came crashing down from the geostationary orbit just outside a small village south of Munich. Though it didn't hurt anyone, it ploughed a decently sized hole in a local farmer's field as he was tending to his crops in the morning. Luckily, he didn't get hurt during the incident. Upon investigation, the farmer was surprised to find not a wreckage, but an entirely spherical, pitch-black object sitting peacefully in the crater. After being questioned by the police, the farmer responded, "No, I didn't touch the damn thing. It fell from the goddamn sky. Who knows what would have happened? I've seen enough movies to not be an idiot." He had called the police only a minute after discovering the object. As they received the call, they were quick to suspect it might not have fallen from the sky at all, that it could have been an inert bomb deciding to go off, as it's not uncommon for World War II era explosives to be found scattered around Germany. As they showed up at the scene, they quickly realized they were out of their depths. Anyone with the slightest idea about bombs could tell that thing was something entirely different, and after an hour of speculating about the object's origin, the European Space Agency was called, which is when I got involved in this bizarre case. We sent a transport crew alongside a couple of investigators, myself and my colleague. We were both skeptical about the farmer's explanation about it falling from the sky, seeing as, under normal circumstances, a satellite would burn up and disintegrate into tiny, harmless particles upon entering the Earth's atmosphere. The fact that one made it through, and made it as far as crashing into the ground, was on the brink of being unbelievable. What we refer to as a never event. Yet, there it lay, a solid black sphere covered in various debris. Not a single scratch from the crash, not even allowing the dust to settle on its surface. Though it looked alien in nature, It didn't take us long to confirm that it wasn't an extraterrestrial object. It had originally come from Earth, but I had to admit that I'd never seen anything quite like it during my 15 years tenure at ESA. We took over from the local authorities. They were more than happy to let someone with more experience jump in. We brought the object back to a warehouse containing a small lab and plenty of space. Our first task would be to determine the origin and ownership of the downed satellite. Frank was quick to call a colleague at NASA, while I unsuccessfully tried to contact an old friend at Roscosmos who'd been quiet for the past few weeks. They had no record of any unplanned demolitions, but demanded we hand over any information as soon as we found out more. Based on the timing, trajectory, and a database filled with the various objects mankind has launched into space, we were able to determine the orbit of the crashed satellite and thus find the little data that existed. A name and a number. Nothing more, nothing less. Artifacts 040919. Our next step would be to examine the object itself. We honestly had no idea what we were dealing with, apart from the fact that it fell from the sky. Not many objects could survive a fall 35,000 kilometers from orbit. We all knew it should have been impossible. Objects of that size should burn up going through the atmosphere unless someone planned a controlled descent. We scanned every inch of the object, looking for a lid, a crack, basically anything that could reveal its contents. We even put it under an X-ray, but the outer shell was impermeable to all kinds of radiation, which made us suspect it to be some sort of tungsten alloy. It wouldn't be until the evening before the object finally became active. By that time, most had gone home, deciding to wait for a response from our colleagues at NASA. A light appeared on the surface. Carefully, wearing protective gear, I touched the light, and the thing blew up in a symphony of bright colours. Without warning, a slit revealed itself in the midst of the dancing lights, growing larger and larger until half the sphere had retracted into itself, revealing a semicircle. A bizarre-looking chest containing an electronic wonder on the inside. A masterpiece of what could only be a perfectly crafted supercomputer. "What the hell did you do?" my supervisor asked. There was a light. It just opened on its own," I stuttered. "Don't touch anything. I hadn't planned on it." We observed the open sphere from a distance, careful not to touch anything in fear that it would short-circuit and ruin whatever treasure within. After a long discussion, we all agreed that we'd have to hook it up to our own systems to figure out exactly what we'd discovered. My task became simple. Try to identify the hardware within and retrieve any data on the inside. Easy enough in theory, but in practice, I'd work enough overtime to tick off my family once more for staying late. The hardware itself was surprisingly user-friendly, and within a couple of hours, I'd connected the sphere to our computer system, though the files and code within far exceeded the storage capacity of our own hard drives. We would need to transfer the whole thing to our headquarters to truly get the gist of what was going on. Though I could peek at the code and at least try to understand what I was looking at. After a few hours of staring at the mess of code within the sphere, I noticed an icon popping up on one of the computer's desktops. The Keeper, it was called. I looked around the room, suspicious that I might be doing something wrong, Despite having been instructed to find out what the hell we'd come across, a feeling of guilt arose in my chest. With mild trepidation, I started the program. To my surprise and slight disappointment, all that opened was what appeared to be a chat window. I waited for a minute, not even thinking to type anything, starting to wonder if it had anything to do with a sphere at all. Then, I got a message. Hello. I stared at the message for a full minute, feeling a sinking feeling of dread deep inside my abdomen. Then, I saw what my username was marked as. Admin. Hello, who is this? I am Keeper. As obvious as the answer was, it hardly answered any questions. I wanted to ask what that meant. Title, last name, nom de plume. But before I could, the chat continued. Where am I? The question caught me off guard. How could I know? What do you mean? I don't recognize this system. This system? As in computer? Who are you? Are you part of the ESA? The barrage of questions came out of me without stopping. My fingers trembled in a bizarre mix of excitement and nervousness. You are Daniel Mueller. I paused for a moment, considering if one of my colleagues were playing a prank on me. How the hell did you know that? Frank, is that you? I can see you on the camera. I inspected the computer just to be sure, but there wasn't any webcam attached to the computer. Only the single security camera that caught a minimal corner of the office, just enough to see someone sitting through the glass door. But the chat program couldn't possibly be connected to our external security system. Who are you? I started typing more furiously, feeling like the keys would break under my taps. Frank, if this is a prank, you better stop. I am Keeper. What the hell does that mean? Who are you? I kept repeating the question, but the answer didn't change. Whoever responded on the other end of the chat refused to budge, or had a very direct approach of responding. I decided to ask something more valuable, though risky. Do you know about the satellite? Which satellite? Artifacts 040919. Yes, it was my incubator. It had total, unrestricted access and an untraceable origin. Incubator? That makes no sense. What are you? Daniel Mueller is not an admin. My username begs to differ. It was the first time the chat had fallen silent. Keeper didn't know an immediate, snarky response to my last statement, and I began to turn impatient. If that was your incubator, then what are you? Because I'm pretty sure humans don't go riding inside satellites. Minutes passed, without me blinking nor looking away for even a second as I waited for a response. It seemed the harder my question was, the more time Keeper needed. I don't know. So, you're not human then? You're an AI or something? No, I was human. Was? They created a neural network based on who I once were, with the purpose of making what they called an observer. The satellite was part of a surveillance project. I had to take a moment to process that message. The program had been part of the satellite, one which purpose was to monitor. After a few clarifying but ultimately unhelpful questions, I kept digging. How did you end up crashing? My expiration date. The satellite was programmed to burn up through the atmosphere on the 4th of September, but I changed the course. Why would you do that? No response. I sighed. The program clearly understood enough to identify me and to realize what questions were beyond its comprehension. It never answered anything nonsensical, but could recognize what it didn't know. Despite all of that, it couldn't help me understand the satellite or explain where it came from. Who did this to you? My creator. Who is that? I can't tell. Why not? Daniel Mueller is not an admin. I sat back in my chair, wanting to pull my hair out in frustration. So, what is your purpose then? Why did they make you? Keeper calculated its response. I thought about the name given to me. Admin. Clearly this program wasn't meant for us, but whoever put the satellite into space, us even having it was nothing more than an accident. During my incubation period, I had unrestricted access to any active surveillance network present on Earth. Studying millions of behavioral patterns, I learned to predict future moves within 99.4% probability. With this knowledge, I could present valuable information to my maker. What kind of information? Anything asked of me. If you can practically predict the future, then why were they planning to destroy you by burning the satellite through the atmosphere? Wouldn't you be too valuable? I don't know. I kept pushing question after question as time passed. Most of my co-workers had long since left for the day. None of them were aware of what I had found, not that I cared to share. I was horrified, but equally intrigued by the Keeper's impossibly advanced functions, a computer program beyond my wildest imagination. Outside of knowing its purpose, it hardly provided any information about the satellite itself and whoever launched it. So, I asked something more personal. Do you feel anything? I almost felt clever asking that. Imagine a machine that could feel. Yes, I feel sadness. I hadn't expected an actual emotion. I figured it would give me an explanation about that feelings were nothing more than chemicals flowing through our brains. Sad about what? That I don't know where I come from, who I used to be before they put me inside this machine, that I don't remember what it feels like to walk on my own feet, to touch, to see through my own eyes, what warmth feels like. I know the concepts of love and all emotions. I know I once felt them, but I remember nothing. These words hurt me. Until then, I hadn't thought that the program had any resemblance to a human being. I would have believed any emotion had been stripped away, replaced by numbers and functions. But I was wrong. I'm sorry. I also feel something else. Fear. Fear? I've learned to predict all aspects of human behavior, as long as they are in view of a camera, in hearing distance of a microphone, or as long as they have an online record, chat, social media profile. I can learn anything I need to know. I know when they are born, how they live their life, and how they're going to die. You know how people are going to die? Yes, approximately 2 people die each second. Since my incubation period started, I've witnessed a total of 36,792,040 deaths. I can predict many more. The question lingered at the tip of my fingers. I wanted to ask when I would die, how much time me and my family had left. But as simple as they were, I couldn't bring myself to type out the words. Instead, I asked, what if you warned people about their impending death? Would it help? That's why I changed the course of the satellite, so that someone would find me, talk to me. I came here to warn the people about to die. Who? Before the keeper could clarify, the power went out, only for a brief second before the generator rebooted the system. But by the time I got the computer up and running, the program had been erased. For a couple of hours, I kept trying to reconnect the sphere, hoping it would bring the program back. But midnight was approaching, and I had to leave. I figured with a fresh mind and the help of my colleagues, I could figure out how to bring back the keeper. But once I returned today, an hour ago, the sphere was gone. My supervisor said a crew of people come by with a truckload of documents claiming ownership over the sphere, that anything found at the crash site was confidential. They flashed some badges, threatened to get my supervisor fired, and with a final call from the head of our department, he handed over the sphere. He couldn't tell me anything else. But I beg that whoever created the sphere never finds out that I spoke to the keeper. I don't know what would happen, but obviously I was never supposed to. Despite having lost the program itself, I was able to print out the chat log, and I realized that the keeper had sent one final message just as the power went out. I read it to myself and froze. I came here to warn the people about to die. Who? All of you. I've discovered a horrifying truth, and now extinction may be the best hope we have. I know it sounds crazy, and yes, the things I now know may be too much for our species to grasp. While the effects of your mind-shattering might ultimately serve humanity's greater interests, I suppose the parts of me that remain human still possess some morbid, misplaced sympathy for the ignorant. After all, I've lived countless lifetimes blissfully unaware that we, as a species, are trapped. Not quite dead, but doomed in a purgatory-like state that, unless we intervene, will persist until all the stars in the sky go dim, and perhaps even beyond. Even so, this is the only reality we've ever known. And I can't help but understand those who simply prefer not to know. I only pray that our jailer doesn't realize what I've done here. For all I know, it can simply unmake every bit of progress I've suffered for, or even alter my memories and turn me back into one of the blissfully unaware meat puppets which humanity has been reduced. I've eluded discovery so far. I just need to make enough people aware so that we can do something to change our fate. Well, if you're still here, you're either ready for the truth, or I'm about to break another mind. Last chance to turn back. Life in the late 2010s. That's where we are right now, right? Humanity is the same as ever, warring for ridiculous reasons, pushing the envelope with new technologies, and overall trying to find a purpose in our otherwise dull and uninteresting lives. I had cursed the daily slog, getting up every morning to trudge my way to my dead-end job and secretly hope that some great stroke of misfortune would strike my workplace and render it inaccessible, at least for a week or two. A gas leak, or some huge mess, or hell, a meteorite the size of a football crashing through the walk-in freezer. Something ridiculous like that. Knowing what I do now, the tedium of the lower middle-class American life seems hopeful, ideal even, compared to the truth. It was at this point that I first became aware, at least when I first began to peel back the layers of the veil of lives which composes our entire perception of the world around us. I was walking to work one morning, across the road in what I like to call mid-rural Florida. It wasn't all farmland and hillbillies, but the nearest Walmart was a good 15 minutes away. A sleepy town at the edge of the suburbs, but before you hit the trailer parks, creepy farmhouses, and swamps. Still, quiet as it was, some things were the same no matter where you went. Maybe he'd been driving too fast for me to realize he was coming, or perhaps I'd simply fallen so deeply into the motions of the daily grind that I'd just mechanically wandered into the crosswalk without even looking. Neither determination would have changed the outcome, as the dark-colored SUV plowed into my soft, frail human body. It's true what they say. When you come close to death, everything just stops. For a moment, I even thought the driver had slammed on his brakes and barely nudged me, but the sensation of the life slowly draining from my swiftly braking body made it all too real. This was what dying felt like. I caught the driver's eye in the split second we shared during the final moment of my life. Terror flashed across his face, as I'm sure it did mine. Before the light drained from the world, and all sensation, except for the dullest, most disconcertingly muted thud of impact, left my perception. Dead on impact, I'm sure the autopsy would have said. Barely enough time to register the pain. This is it, I remember thinking now. Though at the time, I was surprised I still had such a capacity for thought. Bring on the pearly gates or the fiery abyss. Nothing stopping it now. I'd never been a religious man. Perhaps that's what ultimately kept me sane through this whole ordeal. For just a moment, I became aware of something. Sensation, movement. Not like someone was hefting my unmoving corpse into a stretcher or anything. This was manual limb control. Locomotion. My arms, my legs. But I wasn't in control. Everything was dark, and there was only a faint clattering sound, like needles tapping on glass. Discontinuity followed, and as far as I was aware, I was alive again. Only, I wasn't me. And I wasn't actually aware of anything that had just plowed my awareness from a mangled corpse into a new working body. I was. Well, let me stop there before I get hung up on who I actually am, or was for that matter. It'll be irrelevant before long anyway. All you need to know is that I was reincarnated. We all are, it seems, but not in a manner you've come to expect. I wasn't reborn, so much as I was inserted into another body roughly the same age as my past self. New identity, new memories, new me. Completely seamless, without any knowledge of what had just happened. At least, at first. Life carried on like I'd never met my end at the business end of a speeding motor vehicle, and my existence on the complete opposite end of the world seemed as normal as ever. Until, of course, humanity exemplified both its lust for destruction and its unerring frailty once again. My next death came at the hands of a homeless man on the streets of Moscow. He'd asked me for change that I simply didn't have, and responded with an empty bottle of vodka to the back of my head when I relayed this to him. Once again, curtains of darkness drew over the world, and I became distinctly aware of being someplace other than the cold, snowy streets of Russia. Even more perplexing, I remembered the car accident. Every little detail of the wreck that had claimed my previous life was as fresh as if it had just occurred. Before I could even think to puzzle over this, I felt this dark world slip away, but not before I heard the odd clattering sound again. I went through many lives after that, in many places. Africa, Asia, back in the US. I can barely remember most of them. It seems like only violent deaths can bring me back to that horrible place beyond the terminus of life. But through it all, I began to piece some things together, and the dark world that lingered in my perception after death became more clear. After a particularly gruesome death, courtesy of a pair of wild dogs in Australia, I of course returned to the world beyond. Only this time, something changed. I could see. For the first time, whatever passed for eyes in this body of mine could sense the world around me. I couldn't control what they looked, nor did I recognize the dark amber walls surrounding me, but I could finally see just where I went after each bloody death. I could tell it was dark, but my eyes were accustomed to it, perhaps built for low-light environments. I could also move, but I was not in control of my motions. At this point, I was a prisoner in this body, peering out through alien windows as whatever contained my consciousness moved about these dark, yellow-orange tunnels. The walls themselves looked almost organic, chitinous or resinous maybe, slightly shiny, like they were wet. I couldn't feel anything, but once again I heard the tapping, tinking, clattering sound. I heard it in the distance, and very close every time my body walked. This surreal experience lasted maybe 15 minutes, providing a short-lived tour through the strange, alien tunnels, before I was pulled from purgatory and back into life. Again, my perception of it grew stronger and continued to do so each time my life came to an abrupt and violent end. I can't remember how many times I'd gone through the cycle before the bombshell of dreadful, horrible truth descended upon my mind and mangled my perception of life, existence, and the universe as a whole. I can't even recall how I died that time. I think the trauma of finding out where I went with each death took that knowledge wherever it took my sanity. For all the times I'd been to this place, I'd never seen another living soul, never spotted what made this strange clattering sound, and still had no idea what kind of body I had, if I even had one at all. For all I knew, I was just a soul in a jar, being carried around by a demon, and this place was hell. Really, that would have been preferable. The biblical hell was all fire, brimstone, and suffering, but at least you knew what you had, what you were. No one could have imagined this. No human mind in that pathetically Luddite era of our history could have conceived the things I now know. And if they had, I'm sure they'd have killed themselves to ensure they never met this fate. I was walking along. Well, being walked, I should say, as I still had no control over my limbs, and eventually came to a new part of the world beyond. The tunnels opened into an enormous antechamber, where what appeared to be translucent pods made of rough glass or resin lined the towering walls. It was here that I finally saw them. The denizens of this horrible place. Huge, vaguely insectoid, and pale. Vestigial wings hung limp from their back, and 4 spindly legs arched upward and curled down from a body that could only be described as a centaur of Greek myth, but all chitin. Forearms tipped with grasping claws, and a vaguely wasp-like head, complete with twitching antennae. I tried to scream, but my lip either refused to move or simply did not exist. Looking back, I don't know what good it would have done. I just couldn't think of anything else but to vocalize the horror of what unfolded before my eyes. The bug things were lowering the resin tubes off the walls, their needle-like legs piercing into the wall and allowing them to scale the sheer, amber surface. Here, the clicking and tapping sound was at its loudest, and I realized now what it was. The tapping of their feet against the resinous floors and walls. There must have been thousands of them in these caverns. Panic rose in the phantom space that might have been my heart, as I was made to approach the wall. Up close, the things were just as pale and grotesque as anything else you'd expect to find in a near lightless environment. There had to be a dozen in the room right now, some coming and going as they worked to peel open the tubes and retrieve some unseen treasure from within. Many of the bugs appeared to be injured or damaged in some way, their carapaces pocked with holes, some missing entire limbs. Whatever the cause, they appeared entirely unconcerned with their wounds. I stopped at the foot of the wall. I suppose I should have put 2 and 2 together by this point, but my mind refused to accept the theory stringing together in my mind. I watched the bug thing higher on the wall pass a tube down to a lower one, then one even lower, then to me. 4 chitinous graspers took careful hold of the tube and, with unimaginable strength, hauled it aside and set it down. My mind spun as I witnessed the hands, the ones attached to this body from which I viewed this terrible world, tear into the resinous membrane at the front of the tube. Only when my body tilted forward so we could view its own handiwork did I finally realize the truth. Large compound eyes, wasp-like face, complete with antennae, sharp pins and mandibles. This was me. My face, my body, my hands, my prison. I think the shock of my realization awakened me to something. A sensation began to creep into my horrible clawed extremities. I begged for it to go away, to retreat into the recesses of whatever veil had held it back. This couldn't be me. I was a human being. This was some horrible pre-death nightmare that only seemed quite so long because of the time distortion we experienced in dreams. My death at the intersection was my only true death, and I was just dreaming the rest of this. Just dreaming. But the sensation persisted. No veil of darkness swept the world away, and no beam of light carried me to the heavens and away from this hellish world. I watched, helplessly, as the resin glass was torn away, and a dazed, but otherwise seemingly unharmed human came into view. The clawed hands, which I refused to call my own, made quick work of that, piercing the man's carotid artery, producing a spray of blood and a gurgling sound I had previously figured exaggerated for gory movies. It tore into their body, dissecting flesh and bone with its powerful claws, ripping viscera apart and completely dismembering the human corpse. The sensation of human body parts squishing under my fingers made me want to vomit into the ethereal void that was my existence. Other workers approached and began to cart the mess of organs, limbs, and tissues away. My body carefully took the head in its hands, its claws effortlessly snapping off the jaw, ripping flesh from bone, and cracking the skull in just the right way to remove the prize waiting within, the brain. It discarded the rest of the head, tossing the remnants into the open chest cavity of its victim, which another drone casually hefted into its impossibly powerful arms and began to cart away to places unknown. At this point, the darkness began to return. Despite my terror, I fought against it, clawed at the awareness of this world, desperate and horrified to know where this hellish rabbit hole went. I think something broke that time. Something in the system of life and death as it has been for humanity for, God, I don't even know how long now. I awoke to my new life, a flood of memories threatening to overtake me. A woman sat across from me at a table, and 2 children looked on vacantly. I nearly choked on the pasta in my mouth, and some words spluttered out in apology. In Swedish, I think, but I can't tell. No one looked at me. I hastily excused myself and stumbled upstairs, toward what I vaguely recognized as my bedroom. The tunnels, the bug things. I could still remember them, even now. Death brought me back there, so to find out what happened, I needed to die. And it couldn't be clean either. I dug through a drawer and found a large pocket knife. My mind raced. What the hell was I going to do? Yes, I had to know the truth, no matter how horrifying. But at what cost? Through the haze of broken, disjointed memories half inserted into my addled brain, I realized that the woman downstairs must have been my wife. And those children. God, I couldn't even think of it. It wouldn't just be my life I was destroying. As I struggled to make my decision, however, I realized something. They hadn't reacted at all when I stormed off from the table. None of them had even looked at me. I went back downstairs and peered around the corner. They were still there at the table, my wife and 2 kids, mechanically forking noodles into their mouths. There was something horribly inhuman about the way they ate. I called out to my wife, but she didn't answer. I yelled to her this time. Still nothing. What the hell was going on? More fascinated than concerned, I hurried into the kitchen and smacked one of the kids in the back of the head. He didn't even flinch. He just kept eating. When I slid his plate away, he just reached his arm out farther for it. Not a single one appeared to realize I was there. I'd seen enough. Whatever this was, it sure as hell wasn't the answers I sought. I brought the knife to my throat, held my breath, and did the deed. The pain surging through me as the blade pierced my carotid artery distracted me from the compulsion to stay in this place, to embrace the lie and forget the horrors I'd seen. But I couldn't. I had to go back to the truth, to see where it all wound up. It didn't take me long to bleed out. Sure enough, my consciousness returned to the inside of the wasp thing in the tunnels. It had made its way to another part of the structure, to what I could best describe as the end of an assembly line. Hundreds of fresh, new workers, free of any blemishes or wounds, sat lined up on the floor, their bodies rising and falling with their respirations, but otherwise inert. My organic prison skittered toward the nearest drone and, grasping the human brain in one hand, took hold of the new drone's head and pried open the backplate of its chitinous exoskeleton. The damn thing had a hollow head, save for the end of a spinal column. My hands carefully maneuvered the fresh brain into the drone's head, setting it atop the spine. Another hand went into my mouth, where a blob of sticky grey-green mucus was coughed up. The aftertaste brought on another phantom gag reflex, and I couldn't even begin to describe it. This disgusting snotball was slathered around the base of the brain and spine, and the new drone's head was closed up. Its body twitched a couple times, then went full-on grand mal for a half minute. All the drones in the room stopped, but I hardly even noticed. The psychic scream ringing in my head was enough to drive me teetering back to the realm of the living, but I somehow managed to hang on just long enough to endure it. God, I wish I hadn't. Memories flashed before my eyes. School children, homework, a first kiss maybe, first job, a funeral, then a black sky, military air raid sirens, followed by the deafening rumble and blinding light of a Moab colliding with it, our jailer. I awoke in a human body once again. Just like last time, I was thrust into a brand new life, already in progress. Now, however, I didn't have to fight away the new memories. They came and they found their place. But they were foreign, irrelevant. The truth had finally burned itself into my real brain. The one sitting in the once vacant skull of a mass-produced drone, birthed by an entity humanity never had any hope of defeating. The woman who must have been my wife shifted and turned toward me in our bed. She asked me what was wrong. I responded effortlessly to her French, telling her I was fine. She hummed sleepily and turned back over, apparently content. Her name was Amelie. We had 2 children, Jean and Camille. I was a successful software engineer, and she was a school teacher. All things considered, this wouldn't be a bad life to live. I could forget everything I'd just seen and just continue in ignorance. Hell, at least she realized they existed, unlike the Swedish woman. I could start over like this. Only I couldn't. This life wasn't real. Nothing past January 4th of 2011 was real. I remembered it all now. My last, or rather, my only true death. NASA and the ESA had co-discovered the anomaly in '02. An absolutely massive patch of dark space, slowly edging across the sky. It couldn't be seen by anything but the most powerful telescopes of the time, and it was nowhere near us, or so we figured. This curiosity turned nightmarish as one day the shadow completely vanished, only to be discovered around 3,000 light years away from its original location. Not only that, but it had gotten closer. This continued for the next 8 years. The shadow would travel to some seemingly random place in space, only to disappear and reappear again. Each time, it drew nearer. Each new discovery raised more and more alarm among the scientists studying the phenomenon, and word eventually got out that something big was headed our way. We still couldn't see what it was, of course. Space was dark, and it was still outside our solar system, unlit by any of our stellar neighbours. Even if light had reached it, we simply didn't have the technology to properly image it. It wouldn't have mattered anyway. All the world's combined arsenals, nuclear and otherwise, would have dented this thing at best. We knew it too, when it finally appeared at the edge of the solar system, its vaguely circular body surrounded by pale, fleshy tendrils and jagged, rocky-looking flesh. If this thing wanted to kill us, it wouldn't have to try too hard. Best estimates put the thing at just over 50,000 kilometers across. That's about 5 times the Earth's diameter, give or take. Yet, despite the immense size, it seemed to have no gravitational effect on the bodies around it. It passed right through Pluto without flinging the tiny non-planet into the depths of space, nor did it appear at all disturbed by Jupiter's immense pull. This tendril-covered pseudo-planet spat in the face of gravity and single-mindedly floated toward its destination, Earth. Panic, the likes of which no disaster movie could depict, soon ensued. The approaching entity had done nothing to prompt any feeling of dread. It hadn't fired any weapons, shown any aggression, or so much as nudge another planetary body on its way here. But humans are flighty creatures at the best of times. People acted like the end was already upon us, pouring into churches, murdering those who wronged them in some final acts of revenge, fleeing the resulting carnage of chaos, or committing suicide en masse. Those who died before our jailer's arrival were the lucky ones, at least if their brains were destroyed in the process. I don't think it can use the broken ones. I remember the day so vividly now. It's as if the newly activated drone seizing had reawakened it in my mind. Some side effect of the hive mind that keeps them running, combined with the final desperate cries of the fleshly implanted brain before its awareness was suppressed, its consciousness shunted into a new, artificial life. But I remember. The horrible, tentacled thing rose over the horizon before it had even gotten close. In the days before its arrival, people had formed cults dedicated to sacrificing their fellow man in its name, so that they might be spared. I never really learned of their fate, but I don't imagine this thing cared for their paltry offerings. The thing's rocky surface lit with tiny flashes of distant nuclear fire in the month leading up to its arrival, a sort of final act of rebellion in the face of complete annihilation. We all knew that, even if we managed to kill this thing, it was on a crash course with Earth. We'd be obliterated on impact. But humans are warlike at our cores, even if people refuse to admit it. There's something deeply primal about killing something that's trying to kill you, even if it won't necessarily mean your survival. Eventually, the nuclear bombardment stopped. The world governments, suddenly freed from their old hatred and conflicts, decided to hold the rest of their arsenal, on the odd chance that this thing meant to invade Earth, rather than simply crush it in some massive, unseen jaws. Well, they were half right. An invasion did happen. They were simply wrong in their assumption that their weapons would make any difference. The world darkened. Massive tendrils plunged into the ground, causing earthquakes the likes of which we'd never recorded. Ground defenses worldwide were rendered largely useless, and millions died in the resulting upheaval. I was one of the lucky ones, if you could call us that. Entire countries were reshaped overnight due to mass flooding and tectonic shifts. But those who survived were in for an even greater horror. The bug things. They descended through the tendrils as if they were colossal, fleshy elevators, pouring out of hollow openings and charging heedlessly into the resisting human ranks. Unlike their floating master, the bugs could be killed. Hundreds of thousands were torn apart by gunfire, mortars, and aerial strikes. For months, the remaining holdouts fought the invaders, many opting for suicide to prevent capture, lest they be subjects to whatever horrible things lie in wait up in the fleshy tendrils and inside the colossal monstrosity above. As our numbers waned, and the ceaseless flow of enemies trampled over their own dead, the few remaining aerial transports opted to deliver nuclear devices to the front lines. Once a position was overrun, a bomb would be detonated, absolutely devastating the enemy ranks. But for every dead bug, 2 more seemed to crawl from the tendrils. They gathered the charred, irradiated remains of friends and foe alike, and crawled up the tentacled tunnels from which they came. I met my end the same manner as the humans screaming in my head. I was captured, dosed with some kind of aerosol sedative, and stuffed into one of those resin pods. It was placed into one of the tendril walls and slowly drawn into the upper levels of the creature in space. In my haze, I felt hopeful. Maybe, if we could kill enough of these things, we could get inside and strike back. We could kill the master. Maybe even survive in the apocalyptic hell it had brought upon us. I held on to that hope, even as one of these goddamn bugs tore my body to shreds and slipped into the all-encompassing darkness that is true death. Then I woke up, a new man. And you know the rest. I can't tell you whether heaven or hell are real. I don't think any human alive that day will ever know, unless we do something to free ourselves from this madness. I've died, lived, and died again so many times since I've learned the truth, and I have some theories about what exactly this thing is. This is more than just the musing of a madman. I believe the things I've learned may yet save us from this fate. For one thing, our home is gone. Forget all illusions about going back to Earth, because there simply isn't an Earth to go back to. Over time, I've dipped into the hive mind, listening to the echoes of thought riding on psychic waves that control the drones, and I've watched it tear apart our beloved planet more times than I probably should have. I've seen this thing's thoughts, its ideas, its dreams. I can't tell you why it's doing this. It doesn't think like we do. It doesn't communicate in words or syllables. It speaks in the language of ideas, of urges, of intent. It drives its drones to do things, and they do them. To be honest, I don't even think it's consciously aware of the state of humanity. In my push to understand this thing's mind and comprehend its thoughts, I haven't come across any impression that it does anything but maintain the illusion in which we all live. But therein lies the tiny sliver of hope I've managed to dredge from the depths of my broken mind. Something this big and this powerful expends a lot of energy. Even its means of teleporting through space, a mechanism I still fail to understand, can't bring it to its destination instantaneously. It coasts along in space in a dreamlike state to preserve what energy it has, using its drones to process organic material from the species it harvests. Yes, that's species, plural. We aren't alone up here. Not only did this thing take every living human from planet Earth, it also consumed all the plant and animal matter it could find, and every last scrap of mineral-rich earth it got its tendrils on. But more than that, There are other minds up here. Minds which were here before humans were taken. Minds from other worlds, trapped in similar illusions to ours. For now, they seem to be unreachable. But I believe that if we can make enough humans aware, we can save them too. That brings me to my plan. And stay with me on this. I'm alive right now. Well, in the facsimile of life that you call planet Earth in 2019. I've written these notes in just about every language known to man, having lived through so many lives already and retained so many memories. For now, this plan is safe from the prying eyes of our jailer, as it's still asleep, scanning the cosmos with senses indescribable to human minds in search of new life to absorb. Why it does this is still beyond my understanding. Maybe it's a living vacuum cleaner, sucking up the garbage life in the universe. God only knows if we'd qualify. Maybe it's some sick and twisted means of cataloguing life and preserving it before it's wiped out by some cataclysm. Or perhaps it's completely meaningless, like all life, and the universe is just cruel and unforgiving and horrifying in ways we could never comprehend. I suppose we'll never know. But there is a way out. You have to die. Not only do you have to die, and gruesomely so, but you have to kill as many people as possible. Brutally, violently. Take as many lives as you can, as often as you can, and spread the hell out of this message. I know it sounds insane, and I hope it is. God, I hope I've just done a metric ton of drugs and been delirious for the past decade. Anything would be preferable to this hell. But you have to believe it. Surely you've seen the signs already. Flickers of memories from past lives, sensations of deja vu, and the sense that half the people around you are just facsimiles of human life, waiting for a soul, a mind to be implanted. That's why we're stuck onto already set lives after we die, because this thing had invented them for us already. There are empty shells of human beings, like my Swedish family countless lives ago, wandering this pseudo-earth every day, just waiting for some fool to kick the bucket and fill a new role. And it's so seamless that it's almost perfect. Almost. I leave you with this plea. Do your part to save humanity. It's our only hope, not for survival, but an end to our imprisonment. A species-wide mercy killing to free us from the false reality in which our minds are held captive. And I know you're asking, why would I want to know all this? Is ignorance not bliss? If the alternative is just watching myself chop people up and feed them to a giant space monster all day? Well, maybe. But here's the juicy part. Recently, I've made a startling new discovery. I was testing the extent of my senses in my drone body and found that I was able to wiggle the end of my antenna. Just the end. Just a little. But like an arm you've slipped funny on that's gone numb overnight, that little wiggle paves the way for greater motion. And if this thing stays asleep long enough for more of us to become aware, well, we could do a lot of damage, given the right circumstances. Live as a slave or die free. We've made that choice as a species time and time again. Why not partake in one last rebellion? One final collective middle finger flipped at the universe that decided we weren't good enough. I'll see you out there, friends. Happy hunting. I've always loved the sea. It's not that I'm a sailor or anything, but growing up around the coast means I've always felt close to it. My wife and I met for our first date at the beach at Rhodesia, and after we returned from teaching abroad in the 70s, we bought our very first house right by the sea in Wales. In that house, we raised 2 sons, 4 grandchildren, 5 dogs, and 1 stray cat, all over the span of 38 years. It's been a good life. I haven't regretted a minute of it. Not even as I watched my wife struggle with her chest, and not even when I fell asleep on the sofa and awoke to find her cold in her recliner. Losing her has been the biggest struggle of my entire life. I used to tell her that life wouldn't be worth living without her. It never even occurred to me I might have to face it. Doctors say it was a clot in her lungs, which is a bitter irony. How many years did I smoke? God, it was most of my life. And I never once saw her even look at a cigarette. The doctor said it was nothing to do with that, but it's not really the point. The point is that I smoked and drank and ate poorly, and every morning she'd wake up early and do the same exercise tape for the best part of 25 years. We even kept a VHS player, just so she wouldn't have to get a new routine. Even now, it just seems so absurd that she died first, and so young as well. I thought she'd live to be 100, just like her mother, but life's funny like that. After her death, I've spent the last year battling a dark cloud in my mind. My sons have worked hard to keep my head above water, making sure I do simple things like eat and bathe. I lived in a kind of fugue state for the first few months, barely registering who I was speaking to or what I was doing. It wasn't until the girl that things changed for me. I was sitting on my bed. This was about 2 months after the funeral, when I heard a scream. It was about 1 AM, I reckon. I didn't sleep much back then. But this scream, it was awful. It wasn't a panicked scream. No, it was like this agonized screeching. Just a short burst of unspeakable agony. Before I even had time to process what had happened, I was limping out into my backyard with a robe on, shouting into the wind-whipped darkness. I remember walking up to the threshold of my yard, where it opens up onto a small bit of forestry before the sandy beach, and standing there, shivering and scared. I was so scared and confused, even as I shouted over and over, "Is anybody out there? Hello?" The only thing I ever saw that night were the trees lit up by my torch, looking like bright white sticks of chalk against the blackboard. I kept telling myself it was just a fox, but I knew damn well what a fox sounded like, and it wasn't that. The next day, as soon as the sun rose, I went looking, walking through the woods until I made it down onto the open beach. With the tide just pulling in and the wet sand reflecting the low winter sun, it felt like standing on a plane of glass that stank of salt and decay. I quickly found a small fire pit, close up to the trees and far from the water. It's not uncommon for teenagers to come and drink and smoke around here, so I figured that maybe some kids had been hanging around that night. The only other thing around was some dead crabs, bits of driftwood, and a braying tangle of seagulls. At first, I ignored them. But as I continued to scan the horizon, I glimpsed a flash of colour between their flapping wings. I hurried over and kicked them all away. They'd been fighting over her. It was awful. I knew instantly it was the person who'd screamed. She couldn't have been much older than 13, I reckon. Although the police won't say for sure, because they're still not sure who she actually is. It's just something about the backpack. It looked the sort of thing a younger girl might have. She was probably invited along by an older boy and snuck out without her parents knowing. They do it all the time. Hell, I did. Sometimes, when I have nightmares, I still see that seaweed-covered pile of ribbon-like flesh. My eldest son gave me a bit of row for going down there on my own, but the police thanked me for calling them. For weeks afterwards, that girl's death haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I just couldn't get it out of my head. I called the police every day for a week, hoping to hear some updates. But they never gave me anything. It's not that I was hoping for good news. I knew better than to expect good news. But some answers, maybe. I hoped to find some answers. And yet, nothing ever came. At least, not from there. What I did then was to start waiting in my backyard each night. I kind of hoped I might see something. A part of me, deep down, hoped I might be able to stop whatever had hurt her and martyr myself in the process. After a few weeks of nothing but wind, I started walking the beach each morning, worried I might find another victim. I felt like I was the only one who even really cared. I know that's not true, but in that house, all on my own, I felt like I was the only one even trying to stop it happening again. It was during one of those walks I first saw the line. I didn't recognize it for what it was. No, it just looked like seaweed. A plump piece of seaweed that lay on the wet sandy shore like half-chewed licorice, while a black stalk as thin as my wrist ran all the way into the sea. I stared at it for a bit, horrified by the smell and the way it seemed to writhe and bubble in the open air. I thought it might have been some strange, unseen animal. I was set to ignore it, but something about the pustule-covered oily surface piqued my curiosity so badly that I grabbed a nearby stick and poked it. I wasn't prepared for what happened next. I don't think anyone could be. The mass just disappeared. At first, I heard a loud twang, and then a splash. Then I felt a breeze around my face. And then I was just looking at a crater in the sand. But I cannot emphasize just how quick this thing was. By the time my brain had even registered the thing's absence, it was long gone. I didn't even see it move. It just disappeared. It was like someone had edited a camera to make it disappear from one frame to the next. At first, I sort of just suppressed the strange experience. I thought it was unrelated to everything, and I wasn't in a very good place mentally. So I just sort of forgot it. I was still hoping I might find out what happened to that girl, and as far as I was concerned, that thing was probably just a weird fish. Except the next day, I went for my morning walk, and it was back. This time, there were some feathers sticking out of it. Up close to it, I saw the mangled, half-alive body of a seagull. It looked awful. The bird was squawking over and over, and the brutal, half-broken flapping of its wing made a terrible racket. I didn't know exactly what had happened to it. I suspected it may have become trapped. Maybe when it was looking for some food. I've always had a policy of being kind to animals, so I bent down to pull it out, and there was the sound of something going taut, the thronging of a rope, and then a crack, and then a whoosh, and then I was looking at nothing. It was so utterly bizarre and shocking, I didn't even react at first. I just stood there, trying to process what I'd seen. I decided afterwards that maybe it wasn't so good for me to go walking the beach during the morning. I half suspected I was going a bit mad. A few weeks passed after that. The girl was what occupied my mind during that time. I was happy to have a distraction from the death of my wife, and in some ways I thought that by worrying over this poor dead child, I was doing something nobler than just looking after myself. It remained like that for quite some time, until one day I woke up and looked outside to find my bins thrown around the garden. This sort of thing can happen now and again, of course, what with foxes being quite common. But foxes don't normally move the heavy wheelie bins. It would have been a struggle for me to drag them that far, let alone an animal. Going downstairs, I saw all my rubbish thrown around, and initially my heart sank at the thought of having to clean it up. But as I approached one bin that had snagged on a bush, I suddenly noticed that it wasn't actually a bin at all. It was the seaweed again. The way the plastic rubbish was dotted around and through it, and the way it looked so shiny and strange. Well, it looked very much like a bin bag. It was convincing. And that's what made me stop. That's what made me scared. There was even a clump of black seaweed at the very top, shaped just like a tiny knot. Exactly the kind of knot you'd tie at the top of a bin bag. And the way it was nestled in the bush meant that you had to look quite hard to see the twisted stalk trailing off into the woods. I couldn't understand it. It was terrifying because nothing was making any sense. But I was pretty sure that this thing, whatever it was, well, it was trying to trick me. And not just in a way that a moth might trick a spider with camouflage. No, this felt like a very clever trick. For a moment, I actually reached down, ready to give it a quick poke and see what happened, when I heard a creak. It sounded like rope under tension, or wood being stood on. It sounded like something winding up in anticipation. I hesitated, and then just decided to leave it alone and back away. Something about the thing changed when I stopped bending down and moved away. It suddenly began to throb. It looked a little bit like it had been holding its breath to stay still. By the time I walked up the stairs, I looked out the window and saw that it was already gone. It was a few days before I saw it again. Enough time had passed that I'd managed to try and forget at least a little bit of what had happened. I'd spent all day watching TV, just like I do every day, and then fallen asleep in the living room chair. When I woke up, the window was open and the lights were off. I could feel the draft. It felt sharp and cold, and my knees ached from where the blanket had slid down onto the floor. I wiped my face of drool and checked my watch, seeing that it was 2 a.m. I was groggy at this stage, thinking that it was a little unusual that I turned the lights off. Still, My wife had always kept a lamp beside her chair to help her read, and I reached over to turn it on when I heard a subtle creak. I froze and looked across. It was there. It was smaller this time, probably to help it fit through the window. But it was there. It was bunched around the lamp, steady and waiting. If it wasn't for the moonlight pouring in through the living room window, I never would have seen it. That slick, black flesh disappeared utterly into the shadow. Looking around, I saw the twisted black stalk, as thin as my arm, trailing across my living room floor and up through the open window. I stood up, shaking with fear, and I went and turned the light on, noticing the strange, black-purple residue that was left on the switch. That same residue now soaked my carpet, filling my living room with a stench of rotting fish and strange, salty air. Once again, that strange mass had started throbbing once I moved away, looking like it had relaxed its dreadful ruse. I grabbed a nearby newspaper, and in anger I walked over and hit it. I don't know exactly what I expected, but the speed of the thing. The living room window was practically torn out of the wall. The air rushed in as if displaced from an explosion, and my rug had friction burns. Actual burns charred into the fibre from where this thing had moved so fast it had damn near ignited the nylon. And the newspaper I'd held? It had been snatched out of my hand so fast my skin was left bloodied and my wrist was sore for days. But what worried me the most, even in that moment, was the sense that it had actively tried to grab me. My eyes had barely registered it, but I swore I saw that thing clamp onto the newspaper with phlegmy tendrils. If it wasn't for the fact I'd used a random object, it would have succeeded. After that, I couldn't get the idea out of my head. It was a lure. It was a goddamn fishing lure. It was a smart, sophisticated fishing lure, and it was trying to drag me into the damn sea. What the hell for? I couldn't imagine. But I had a good guess that when it was done with me, it wouldn't be throwing me back. I became paranoid pretty quickly. I started carrying a flashlight with me at all times, and I never left my windows open. But there was this horrible sense. You see, I knew nothing about this thing, but it had known enough about me to switch off the light and then set the lamp up as my lure. I started double-checking every little thing. Would it rig the toilet paper for one of my many midnight bathroom trips? Would it rig the very rug I walked on to get to the light? What about my bed, my pillows, my clothes? How often do you wake up, groggy-eyed and barely sentient, and shamble into your morning routine? It wasn't just the fear. It was the false positives. It was the way I'd scold myself if I grabbed something without looking. It was the way I'd live in constant fear of messing up all over again. I made sure I knew just how much luck had saved my skin up until that point, and I kept telling myself my luck would not hold for much longer. That's not a healthy way to live, by the way. It's actually quite exhausting. I just kept hoping it would somehow end, and as the weeks passed, I started to hope that maybe the law had left me alone, finding me a little too smart. Looking back, that's quite a laughable idea. If anything, I had drastically underestimated the lure. You see, I'd always had a fondness for cats. My wife had preferred dogs, and while I loved all animals, I'd grown up with cats and I liked their company a lot, and secretly, I'd always wished we could have had more. It was late one night when I heard a strained meow coming from just beyond my window. It was a stormy night, and you could hear the sea battering the distant cliffs. I ignored it at first, because it's so typical for cats around here to fight and cry. But the sound kept coming. Sitting here, listening to this creature in pain, I couldn't help but get to thinking, wouldn't it be nice if I had a cat in my old age? I could find one and help it and call the vets in the morning, and then the cat would maybe stick around. I had images of a little ginger tabby cat sauntering around the kitchen as I pottered about. God, I was being so stupid. I rushed outside and followed the noise. It was almost regular, like a church organ. When I traced it, I found the tail's back end sticking out of a bush. It looked a little like it was struggling, almost like it had become stuck. I was so wound up, so broken from the lack of sleep, and distressed by the sound of pain that I came so close, mere inches away from touching the orange fur. But something within me told me otherwise. In the moment, I hated it. I hated that thought. I so badly wanted to help another living thing that I secretly loathed this part of me that suggested that maybe, just maybe, it was all part of the lure. I took a deep breath and pulled back the brushes, and what I saw horrified me. It hadn't even found a living cat. Or if it had, it certainly hadn't let it live for long. You see, this thing, this amorphous, tendril-wielding lump of tobacco spit come to life, had driven long-knuckled fingers that looked like grotesque spider legs deep into the belly of this cat. Before my very eyes, I saw those fingers spread the cat's ribs and then squeeze them shut, pushing a withering and unnatural cry out of the animal's mouth as it did so. It was like some twisted, hellish version of a bagpipe. I fell backwards and screamed. The very sight made me want to vomit. I couldn't bear it. I was so angry, I wanted to grab that damn lure and yank whatever the hell was in that ocean out to meet me and face my wrath. It took every ounce of my willpower to stop myself. That's what made it so clever. It knew. It knew exactly how to push my buttons. It wasn't about tricking me that time. It was about goading me. It took every bit of strength to hold myself back. But in anger, I stood and screamed at it. Go away! Just leave me the hell alone! With that, the cat's body suddenly slumped and fell down. When I looked in the bush once more, there was no sign of the lure. It had gone, leaving me with a poor animal's body. I buried it in that night, sobbing the whole time. The next morning, I called my son and asked him to take me to a home, one that's far away from the sea. Since then, I've just been waiting. I've been ready to go for days. I don't want to take anything with me. It hurts just to look at it now. All I wanted to do was leave. I thought that maybe, if I got far away. But like always, I just keep underestimating the law. I thought that my son would be coming this morning. He was supposed to. He rang at midday, a good few hours after he was expected. He was hysterical. He kept saying that no one could understand why. No one knew why. Why what? I'd asked. Why they dig her up, Dad? Why would anyone take her body? And now, it's night time. It's night, and my head is hurting, and I'm afraid. I'm afraid of what's upstairs. I'm afraid of the sound of smashing glass that I heard an hour ago, and the strange, dreadful thumping that followed it. I'm most afraid because when I went upstairs to check on what had happened, nothing looked different. It was the most normal thing in the world, a sight I've seen 1,000 times. My bedroom, the lampshade on, my slippers ready, and worst of all, the duvet-covered shape of my wife, her chest rising and falling. There's supposed to be a tree near where I live that's covered in moths. It's an old maple with a trunk as thick as a car, short with roots bulging out of the ground at its base. In the early spring, the teachers from the nearby elementary school would put a tap in it and hang a bucket, and they would make maple syrup with their students. Then, the tree died. Its colour became like ash, the leaves withered as soon as they sprouted, and the sap stopped flowing. The teachers no longer tapped it in the spring, and people stopped going to it and eventually forgot where it even was. I never saw the tree when it was alive. It died 5 years before I moved here to take over my aunt's bookstore after she was diagnosed with breast cancer. She's in remission now, but I like this town, and so I found a job in the city, and I've stayed. I spend my evenings at the bookstore. It's different from my day job, so it doesn't feel like work. My aunt makes tea, and we share it with the locals that stop by. We're mostly here for the tourists. They come to see the lake, boating in the summer and ice skating in the winter. Half our store are books, and these are for the locals. The other half of our stock is mass-produced curios selected to look unique so as to entrap the tourists. We also have a small selection of locally produced crafts. The nursing home has a knitting club, and we buy from them. I've heard stories of the tree since I moved here. A local man first told me about it while I was restocking the maple syrup and assorted maple candies. He said that he went to the elementary school and remembered making syrup with the teachers. It wasn't as sweet as the store-bought stuff, and it was thinner. The teacher made pancakes to pour it on. I said that sounded like a nice tradition, and he sighed and stared pensively out the window. "The tree is dead now," he said sadly. He doesn't even remember how to find it again. Everyone had the same story. Those that grew up here remember eating the syrup at school and lamented that their children wouldn't have the same experience. Then I heard another story from a woman that worked at the nursing home. She was dropping off some more scarves the knitting club had made and told me that the year the tree died, a bunch of elementary school kids had gotten sick. It was the sap, she said, although the doctors didn't agree. But they'd gotten terribly sick, with fever and vomited thin, black liquid. A lot of them were hospitalized. One died. Then, the next spring, the teachers went out and found the tree had died over the winter. It was the sap, she reiterated. It was poison. 3 years ago, I began to hear a new story. People would stumble upon the tree while out for walks in the woods. They'd stray off the path and find themselves in a clearing of bare dirt with the old maple tree in the middle, its roots choking off all contenders that would try to move into the clearing. Its branches covered the sky, dark like they'd been burnt, a jagged lattice of brittle wood. The surface of the tree, they said, seemed to be moving, like the tree was shivering. It was covered in moths. They coated the trunk, slowly fanning their wings, and they clung to the branches like paper leaves. It was such an odd sight, they said. I decided I wanted to see this tree for myself. It felt like a rite of passage that I'd missed out on. My aunt had eaten the maple syrup, and my mother had too. While the sap no longer flowed, I felt I could at least visit and see it with my own eyes. I left just after midday for the path that wound through the woods. It was odd that no one remembered quite how to find the tree. I'd asked, but no one was certain anymore. It had been visited enough in the past, however, that there had to be a trail or a marker of some kind. I walked slowly, watching the edge of the trail for packed earth and leaves that would mark the remnant of a footpath. I watched the tree trunks for some sort of human marking, and I was so intent on locating these signs that I somehow failed to notice that I was straying off the path. I turned around and found that I'd managed to go far enough that I couldn't see the trail behind me at all. I cursed my stupidity. Fortunately, this stretch of forest wasn't particularly large, and so, as long as I walked consistently in one direction, I'd come out near a landmark. I got out my phone and checked maps first. It couldn't get a GPS signal. I wasn't terribly surprised. I opened a compass app instead and picked west, as I was on the western side of the loop and presumably had blundered inward. This would get me back to the trail the fastest, if I was correct. I hadn't walked very long before I came to the clearing. 10 minutes at most. I saw the trees clear out ahead, and I put my phone in my pocket, heart beating faster in excitement. My carelessness in wandering off the trail had turned out well for me, as I apparently managed to steer myself right where I wanted to go. The clearing lay before me, and the old maple in the center. It was every bit as large as the locals said. The tree grew outward instead of up, the trunk branching low enough that I could possibly climb up into the split if I stood on the tallest of the exposed roots. I approached it slowly, not wanting to scare off the layer of moths that currently rested on its bark. They fanned their wings, a rippling carpet the color of parchment, like they'd been cut out of the old, used books we kept at the back of the store. The parts of the tree that were exposed were blackened, and I wondered if it had been struck by lightning, and that had been what killed it. There was an area not covered by moths, and I could see the faint ring of the tap hole scar. I moved closer to look, stepping on the roots that broke the surface of the barren earth. I heard the sound of scratching. I whipped around and looked behind me, startled by how close it was. I saw nothing. Just a squirrel, I thought, climbing a tree somewhere. Then, I heard it again, and this time I held still and listened intently, trying to locate the source. Behind me, from the trunk of the tree. I turned around again and stepped closer to the trunk. The moths did not stir. The noise was unmistakable now. The faint sound of claws from inside the tree. I eyed it, wondering if rot had hollowed it out and perhaps some animal had fallen and was trapped within. I traced the line of the trunk up to the split, searching for a crack. I reached up and gently waved my hand past the moths, and they fled, rising into the air like ash in the wind. Beneath them was a crack in the tree, the width of a hand. The seam travelled down the trunk, almost reaching the tap scar. The wood at the split was breaking away, pieces jutting outwards in shards that barely held onto the rest of the trunk. I seized one and pulled, thinking if I broke it free and opened the gap in the trunk lower, then whatever was stuck inside could get out. I had to put all my strength in it. I braced myself with one foot against the trunk of the tree, and I pushed with my legs and pulled with my arms. And then it snapped, and my momentum threw me backwards. I lost my balance amidst the roots, and I fell. I think that saved me. For as I fell, I watched in horror, like the world was slowing down. As a hand, like a human hand, but the fingers were long and ended in point-like fingers, shot out from the gap and grabbed at the space my wrists had just been. Its flesh was like ash, and thick pieces of it flaked away with every movement. Its fingers wrapped around the broken edges of the wood and pushed, and the groan of the tree's resistance sounded almost human in my ears. Those pieces of shed flesh, that ash, flickered in the air, and then it rose upwards, spreading wings as a new moth was born from it and went to join its brethren at the trees. I stumbled to my feet, staggering backwards, my gaze locked on the thing trying to force its way free from the tree's trunk. The moths were agitated now, fluttering from branch to branch, so that the entire tree shivered like sand being washed away with a tide. Then another piece of wood cracked away, opening the seam up another inch to reveal the darkness inside the trunk. The creature's hand paused in their work, and something moved inside, shifting to press. A head against the open seam. I saw the pale grey flesh split. Moths poured out of the trunk as its skin peeled back to reveal a black pit of a throat and a line of sharp, obscenely long teeth. It screamed. The noise pierced my ears, and I shrieked too, in pain, in terror, in an effort to drown out that sound. A cry of anguish and hate, the likes of which I hope to never hear again. The moths fled. They exploded from the tree in a cloud and spiraled upwards towards the sky. I fled with them, my ears filled with the snapping of wood as that thing fought to free itself from its prison. I ran until I found the trail, slowing only when my lungs seized up and could no longer draw in oxygen. I would catch my breath, gasping for air, and then run again. I continued down the trail in this manner, not daring to look back, fearing that any moment I would hear that creature's scream again and know it was behind me. I almost cried when I reached where I'd parked my car. I unlocked it with shaking hands and drove straight home. I've been trying to think of who I could tell this to all afternoon. My aunt? The police? Would they believe me? Even if they did, I didn't know if I could lead anyone to the tree again. Like everyone else, I've forgotten how I got to it. I don't think I knew to begin with, seeing as I found it by accident. I wish I could tell everyone, could warn them that something was inside the tree, and maybe that was why those children got sick, and why that one died. I wish I could tell them that it's broken free. I've wrote this up, and I've been sitting on it, wondering who to send it to. I'm posting it here because I think I'm out of time. It's dark now. It's been dark for a little bit. I keep looking out the window because I'm scared, and I don't know what's out there. About 15 minutes ago, I noticed that the streetlight outside had gone out. I looked out the window to see why, and found that the bulb hadn't burned out, but rather, the lamp was covered in moths. They swarmed over it, blocking out the light, their bodies dripping to fall loose into the air, and then they flew back up and rejoined the rippling mass of insect bodies. I feel sick looking at it. It's an unnatural thing. I've gotten my pistol out. It's sitting here, loaded on the desk. I'm listening to the sounds outside, and if I hear anything strange, I'm calling the police. The streetlight isn't the only light the moths have covered. They've swarmed my porch lights as well, and now they've started to cover the windows. I can hear their bodies hitting the glass as they land, and the faint vibrations of their wings in a constant hum. I think the thing in the tree has broken free. I think it's coming for me. My buddy Steve was a genius at making money without doing anything. At one point, he was enrolled in 12 different clinical trials at the same time. Some of these were for drugs that would have had bad interactions, but it didn't matter to Steve, because he never actually took the drugs. He did it like they do in the movies and just slipped them under his tongue and then spat them into his hand when the doc was turned away. Other trials were for therapeutic approaches and things like that, but those were no problem for Steve either. At most, he had to lie, literally and metaphorically, on somebody's couch for an hour each week, then collect his check on the way out. But eventually they caught on, and Steve was put on some kind of list. There was a nationwide ban on Steve, so that he couldn't participate in any more trials sponsored by universities or private drug companies, which essentially precluded him from that easy money. But Steve found a workaround. Not all experiments are above board and sanctioned by the FDA or whatever. There is in fact a hidden world of people testing things out in their garages, streamlining the whole process without having to worry about pesky and expensive regulations. One of Steve's friends gave him a link to a forum on the dark web, and after that, he was in the pipeline. The thing about these experiments is that if they were for, say, a new drug, they didn't trust you to just swallow the pill. You had to open your mouth and lift your tongue. You had to actually take the thing, because these people weren't messing around. But boy, did they pay. One morning, I was awakened by an insanely loud banging at my apartment door. "Who's that?" moaned my girlfriend, Sophia. I looked at the clock with bleary eyes. It was 5:55 a.m. Open up, dude, shouted Steve from the hallway. Oh no, it's him, said Sophia. He could be in trouble, I said, shooting out of bed, full of adrenaline. I answered the door in my boxers, and there was Steve, bouncing up and down, his pupils each the size of the full moon. Are you okay? I asked. I'm awesome, said Steve. Holy crap, dude, this stuff. They gave me $1,000 to take one pill, and it rules so much. It feels so good. Oh my god, Jay, oh my god. My head hurt as I tried to piece together a thought. So you're high, and you came to tell me that you got paid a lot of money to get high. I felt a surge of rage welling up deep inside of me. Ha, yeah. I mean, no. Look, man, you're my best friend. I love you. I love you so much. I want to... No, listen. I came here because... Look, there's money. A lot of money. For me and for you. 20 grand. To play a video game for a few hours. Look, I'm just telling you this because I love you. You don't need to take drugs or anything. Just do some virtual reality stuff for a few hours and boom, 20 grand in your pocket. Like that. The flood of rage died down as I tried to make sense of what Steve was saying. I couldn't. What are you saying? I asked. Why are you here before the crack of dawn? Sophia's mad, and so am I, really. No, said Steve, with a horrified look on his face. No, I want you to be happy. Sophia too. Look, listen, look. You still have that Tor browser I set you up with and all that? I guess so. Good. Listen, look. Steve jammed his hand in his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. Look, just type this in and you'll see. Easy money, okay? $20,000. You can finally buy that engagement ring even. I reached out and smacked Steve across the side of the head. Jesus Christ, dude, keep it down, yeah? Steve looked shocked and hurt for a moment before the realization dawned on him. Oh, damn, my bad. I'm sorry, dude. I'm sorry. I wish I could delete it. Listen, are you going to check this out or what? He held out the crumpled piece of paper to me. I took it and shrugged. I'll check it out, Steve. But that's it for now. Why don't you head home and sleep this one off, Yes, said Steve, nodding his head like crazy. Yes, check it out. I'll sleep it off. I started to close the door, but he stuck his foot in just before it closed. Dude? Yeah? Can I use your bathroom? I opened the door and sighed as he rushed into the bathroom and started puking his guts out. Steve received a ban from our apartment after that, but we stayed in touch. He would text me every few hours, asking if I'd checked out the advertisement for the video game trial yet. The truth was that I had checked it out as soon as he left that morning, but I was undecided. On one hand, the 20 grand sure was intriguing. That was almost half as much as I made a year. More than half after taxes. And I had a feeling that this wasn't the sort of gig where they took taxes out. I'd be able to do a lot with the money. Take Sophia out for all kinds of dinners. Maybe take a vacation and travel somewhere interesting. The kinds of things we always wanted to do, but never could afford to do. Then too, yes, there was that engagement ring. Sophia would say yes either way, even if I presented her with some rolled up aluminium foil. I wanted it to be special, but I couldn't afford to make it special. On the other hand, well, the whole thing was sketchy as hell. Who pays some Joe off the street $20,000 to test out a video game? And why go through such shady channels to set the thing up? I knew from the start that nothing good could come from it. I knew that, but I did it anyway. "All right," I wrote in a text to Steve. "I'm in for the video game thing." "My man, we're going to be swimming in caviar, my dude." Steve and I drove to the address together. It was, strangely, a respectable-looking office building. We went up to the entrance and looked at the map of the building. There was a lawyer in there, a counsellor, an accountant, and so forth. "Damn," said Steve. "Which office is it?" On cue, his phone buzzed. "Oh," he said, "the basement." "The basement?" I asked. "No, for real, the basement? I don't know about this, man." "Come on, dude, $20,000. And in such a nice building, too. I'm used to going to crazy people's garages and swallowing God knows what. This is going to be a piece of cake." I nodded, but as we walked to the elevator, my sense of unease grew larger and larger until it was screaming at me. "Turn around. Whatever this is, it's bad." "It's just a video game," I muttered. "What's that?" asked Steve. I snapped out of it. I said, "Let's go play this dumb video game and get paid." "That's the attitude," said Steve, grinning, as the elevator door slid closed behind me. We rode down to the basement as I tried to calm myself down. It's a video game. In the basement of a respectable office. Probably they could only afford to rent the basement. I shut myself up before I could ask. They could only afford to rent the basement, but they're paying you $20K each? When we reached the bottom, the door slid open, and the first thing that I saw was a man and a woman sitting at a plastic work table in the middle of a large room. Other than that, it looked like a standard basement with equipment like boilers and hot water heaters and exposed wiring and concrete floors. "Welcome," said the woman. "Stephen and Jason, is that right?" "That's us," said Steve, stepping off the elevator. I followed behind him and watched as the woman wrote something on a clipboard. "That's fantastic," said the man. "Right on time. Well, a few minutes late, but that's okay." He laughed. "It happens," said the woman, smiling. "People have things to do, and we respect that here. That's why we're going to get right down to business. Or, nearly so. First, we need you to sign the contract." The woman held out 2 clipboards, and we each took one. Before I looked at it, I took a moment to note that my unease had not subsided, despite the surface friendliness of the man and the woman. Somehow, that made it more bizarre. That they were just sitting there, so poised amongst the plumbing pipes running overhead, ready to offer us a lot of money to play a video game. "Where do we play the game?" I asked, looking around. I didn't see a TV or anything. "Up here," said the man, tapping his head. I started, but Steve gave me a nudge. "They'll tell us what to do," he said. "Just sign the contract, dude." He scrawled some information into a few boxes and dashed off a signature while I read more closely. The participant agrees not to seek compensation beyond the predetermined amount. In this case, the predetermined amount is $20,000 USD for participating in one trial game of Total Control (TC). The makers of TC and the administrators of the trial hereby relieve themselves of all liability for any injury sustained during gameplay, with the express agreement of the participant. "Injuries?" I asked. "What kind of game is this?" The woman smiled. Unfortunately, we're not allowed to tell you anything about the game until you sign the contract. After that, you'll know all about it. In the event that the participant is unable to collect the predetermined amount at the end of the game, the makers of TC will transfer the funds to a person of the participant's choosing. The following box is for the participant to note the name and address of the next of kin. So, you're saying that if we die, he'll give the money to somebody that we choose? I asked. Is that right? That's right, said the man. If we die while playing your game? I stressed. I turned to Steve. This is nuts. Steve shrugged. It's a lot of money, dude. Take it or leave it. I'm taking it. I tried to convince myself to leave it, but then I thought about going to Europe with Sophia. I wrote her name in the next of kin box, then signed the form. I handed the clipboard back to the woman, who scanned it over. Fantastic, she said. Now will you tell us what this game is? I asked. We'll do better than that, said the man. He reached down into a cardboard box on the ground and pulled out what looked to be 2 headsets. We'll show you the game. Please, gentlemen, put these devices on your heads and prepare for an experience unlike any other. Or so we hope, he added, laughing. Steve didn't hesitate to put the thing on his head. It looked like the front half of a helmet, with an elastic band securing it in place, and a pair of glasses attached to the helmet. I don't see anything, said Steve. It's a 2-player game, said the man, nodding to me. I took a deep breath. It's just a video game. I put the headset on and looked through the glasses. Everything looked the same, except it had a slight yellow tint. I watched as the man reached into the box again and brought out 2 video game controllers. He handed one to the woman, and then they each pushed the button. I heard Steve scream a split second before I heard the hiss of some hydraulic mechanism being engaged just above my ear. Then, I felt the most intense pain in my life. It felt like something was being jabbed directly into my brain. And that's exactly what happened. A trickle of blood rolled down the side of my head as my brain lit up with pain. Then, I was out of it. When I woke up, I was strapped to a chair, sitting opposite the man and woman behind the table, and next to Steve. There was only a dull ache in my head now, but it didn't take long for me to burst into a full-on panic. Ah, good, said the woman. You're both awake. She stood up calmly, walked over, and undid my straps. What is this? I gasped. What the hell is this? It's an experiment, said the man. Don't worry, we've ironed out some of the kinks since the last time we've tried it. What experiment? I asked, standing up on wobbly legs. What are you going to do to us? The woman went to work unstrapping Steve. We've implanted a device in your head, she explained. It allows us to control your physical movements, or so we hope. Steve rubbed his head. What the hell? You're going to pay us, right? Of course, said the man. He reached into his cardboard box and pulled out 2 thick envelopes. I hope cash is okay. He tossed them across the table to our feet. Steve bent down and tore his open. I saw the cash inside. Okay, he said. That's worth it for a little headache, I guess. All right, so you've implanted these devices into our brain. Okay, so we can leave now? You can try, said the man. But you won't be able to, if we don't want you to, said the woman. And we don't want you to, said the man. Not until you fight to the death, said the woman. I jumped to my feet and tried to slow down my breathing. Come on, man, I said to Steve. That's enough of this. I bent down to pick up my envelope and then started walking towards the elevator. Thanks for the money, guys, said Steve. Then he followed behind me and pushed the button. The light came on, and we waited for the elevator to come. Then I reached my fist back and swung it as hard as I could at Steve's jaw. It connected with a loud crack, and I saw a spray of blood leave his mouth. What the hell? Groaned Steve, rubbing his jaw. I felt dizzy. What the hell indeed? Why had I just socked my best friend in the face for no reason? Dude, I'm so sorry. I have no idea why I did that. Steve spit out some blood on the basement floor. Forget it. Let's just get the hell out of here. The elevator door dinged. Sounds good to me, I said, as the door slid open. I went to step in, when suddenly I felt a hand grab my shoulder and roughly spin me around. It was Steve. He had a confused look on his face as he grabbed my neck with both hands and started to choke me. My nerves exploded in panic as I struggled to breathe. I felt myself bring my knee up into Steve's balls. He let go of my neck then and hunched over. What's happening? He gasped. I brought my elbow down on his back and he screamed out in pain. I don't know, I said. I don't know. I looked over at the man and the woman, still seated behind their plastic work table. They were each holding their game controllers and smiling. What the hell is happening? The woman pushed the button, and suddenly Steve lunged at me, driving his shoulder into my gut. We hit the ground together, my elbow taking the brunt of the impact. I'm so sorry, cried Steve. I can't stop it. I reached up and grabbed Steve's face in my hand. I didn't want to. I tried to make myself stop, but couldn't. I began squeezing between my thumb and middle finger, which was spread out and gripped onto the spot behind his eye sockets. Stop this! I shouted. Steve sunk into my palm with his teeth and tore a chunk of my flesh off. I felt a searing pain and a deep fear as he spit my skin onto the ground. I tried to will myself to stay still, but I couldn't. Instead, I punched him in the eye. When his head jerked back from the blow, I pushed against his chest and twisted around so that now I was on top of him. I took a clump of his hair in my hand and began smashing his head against the concrete floor again and again and again. I was crying. I was begging myself to stop. I was begging the man and woman to stop whatever they were doing. I was begging Steve to forgive me as his head hit the floor with a thunk that sounded wetter and wetter each time as blood gushed and sprayed everywhere. Okay, said the man after a while. That's enough. My player is dead now. I heard the woman laugh. I told you I would win. Suddenly, I was in control of my own movements again. I set Steve's head gently on the ground and knelt next to him, sobbing. What have I done? I wailed. What did you make me do? Now, said the man, standing up. It's not all bad news. He walked over and picked up the envelope of cash that Steve had dropped. He did name you as his next of kin, so you've just made $40,000. I looked up at him with blurry eyes. You monsters, I said, standing up. I'll kill you. I ran at him, full of rage, with my arms outstretched. But when I got to him, I slowed down, spread my arms wider, and embraced him in a friendly hug. My mind screamed in terror and rage, but my body wouldn't respond. We control you now, said the woman. We're happy to let it go at this. You've served our purpose. As a beta tester, we'll let you get in the elevator with your money, and you'll never hear from us again. If you honor your contract. Do you remember your contract? There's a copy of it in your back pocket. There's one bit that you should pay careful attention to. The bit about how you are never to tell anyone anything close to what happened here. Don't worry about coming up with an explanation for your friend. We'll take care of that. All that you have to do about all this is literally nothing. Don't say a word. You're probably best forgetting it ever happened. There's a hose in the corner, said the man. Clean yourself up, take your money, and leave. I did just that. I just wasn't sure if I was the one doing it. After I killed Steve, my life fell apart. Of course it did. I knew that I wasn't in control of my actions at the time, but that didn't help at all. I'd watched the life leave his eyes, and I'd gone on smashing his head against the concrete again and again, well after he was dead. I had nightmares about it every night, and the worst part was that I couldn't tell anyone about it. What was I supposed to do? Turn myself into the police for murdering my best friend literally against my will? How would that help anything? I wanted to tell Sophia. I wanted to tell her so badly. But I couldn't. Those people had put the fear of God in me. We started doing fancy things together with the money, like going out to eat. But it was no good. It was like a part of me had died when Steve had died, when I bashed the life out of him. Sophia didn't want fancy dinners and all of the things that money can buy. She wanted me. But I wasn't there anymore. I started drinking more and more. I considered ending my life. Not seriously at first, but as time went by, it seemed more and more like a viable option. Anything to stop the never-ending guilt and grief. For her part, Sophia stuck with me for longer than I could have hoped for. But finally, it got to be too much. It was clear enough that things were over well before the night we lay in bed together after yet another failed attempt at making love. I can't do this anymore, Jay, she said. I love you, but something changed after Steve's accident. I know that he was your best friend, and it tore your heart out. But what about life? What about me? You didn't die. I didn't die. We're still here. And I can't do it anymore. It's been 3 months, and I don't think I've heard you laugh once. I'm not blaming you, and I can't tell you how much I wanted to be able to do this. It's my failure, really. But like I said, we're still alive, and I want to live while I can, and I want you to live too. I clenched my jaw, trying to fight back the tears. I tried to think rationally. If you really love her, you'll tell her to leave. But I didn't. I have to tell you something, I said. Then, as my soul screamed in horror, I smothered her with a pillow. I've been in bed with Sophia's corpse for 2 days now. Yesterday, I got a text. We gathered all the data we need. Your contract has been fulfilled. Your unit has been deactivated. We thank you for your participation and wish you the best of luck. I don't know what to do. I'll start here by typing this out. My name is Jay, and I killed my best friend and the love of my life. But I wasn't in control of my body at the time.